Now, I'd like you to please join me in welcoming our speaker, Keith Hiracawa. Since 2009, Keith has lived in Wynantskill with his two boys, Owen and Ethan. They spend their time exploring the woods and creeks of the Rensselaer Plateau and southern Vermont, usually finding things to jump from into water with their yellow lab, Lucy. During the warm months of the year, you can spot their car by the kayaks on the roof and the bikes loaded on the trunk. While growing up, Keith lived in several cities on the East Coast, but spent most of his time in the hills and valleys of southern Vermont, wandering woods and waterways. After college, Keith studied law and philosophy at the University of Connecticut, then specialized his studies in environmental law at Lewis and Clark in Portland, Oregon. He remained in the Pacific Northwest to practice law, representing community groups and environmental organizations in land use and environmental disputes. After the birth of his oldest son, Owen, he shifted to full-time teaching, and he has taught at the University of Oregon School of Law, Texas A&M School of Law, which is formerly Texas Wesleyan, and Albany Law School. He's published 3 books and dozens of articles on environmental law and ethics, land use planning, climate change, sustainability, and property. His current research focuses on local environmental governments and ecosystem services, that is, the manner in which functioning ecosystems provide valuable benefits to human life and well-being. Keith is currently Associate Dean of Research and Scholarship and Professor of Law at Albany Law School, as well as a member of the RPA, Rensselaer Plateau Alliance Board of Directors. Welcome, Keith, and thank you for being here with us tonight.
Thanks, Dan. I think that's more than I knew about myself, and it was a very kind introduction. I really appreciate it. Good evening. My name is Keith Hiracawa. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I give this talk with the Rensselaer Plateau Alliance, which occupies the ancestral lands of the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohican Indians. These are the actively occupied lands of the indigenous peoples that successfully resisted hundreds of years of active warfare and human rights crimes as they resisted genocide and forced removal, which continue today, as the murderous system of the Indian boarding schools is slowly coming to public eye. I want to acknowledge their ancestors who lived across the area, stewarded the lands, enriched the biodiversity, and engaged in trade and exchange with other peoples across the continent for millennia. I want to acknowledge their children and children's children who live here today, and those who were removed yet maintain and renew their relations and connections to their homelands today as they build new governments and continue their old ones, heal themselves and each other, exercise their rights and traditions, and create new ones for the next generations. I want to acknowledge that this land is rightfully theirs and commit to support in my work as an educator to highlight the achievements and history and current work of the indigenous peoples, the need to support their search for justice and reconciliation, and plan to use my access to educational platforms, classrooms, and public venues in support of indigenous peoples and their rights. I am honored to be here, and I appreciate that you all are joining us tonight. The question for tonight is whether we are committed to being anti-racist. I'll address this question in examining race and space and place. In the process, we need to keep our eyes on whether our people, communities, and projects exclude or include others, whether we sustain or undermine privilege and power, and whether we build upon or confront a racist past. We cannot be both, and we cannot be neither. As Ibram Kendi writes, every policy in every institution, in every community, in every nation is producing or sustaining either racial inequity or equity between racial groups. The idea of middle ground in the face of racism is illusory. We do not get a pass by holding middle ground. Failing to identify and reverse racism is an act of racism, and it is an act of violence. Now, this may be uncomfortable. Race is often an uncomfortable topic, but we often hear that racism has been forced into the shadows of society, even though we know that that's not true. It's common to hear people proclaim that they're not racist because they love all people or accept all people and that all lives matter. But that's not good evidence that we've eliminated racism. Those kinds of statements are good evidence of privilege, a circumstance of being free from the obstacles that plague the lives of others. Privilege often goes unnoticed by those who enjoy it. Privileged folks often do not acknowledge the obstacles that others endure and do not grasp fine image of police or wealth or forest or Confederate flags have very different meanings to different people. Although we will not be able to unpack all of that tonight, I hope to pick up on a few clues to illustrate the persistence of racism in places that we might not expect, to see if we can excavate some examples of privilege in our very normal activities and identify some ways and some actions that can be taken to move the needle in a different direction. Note, I'm avoiding talking about moving the needle forward because that would assume that we were going the right direction in the first place, and I'm not sure that's the case. So tonight we'll talk about race and space and place, and we'll start with race. We often talk about race as a social construct. Social constructions underlie and filter all the kinds of information that can become forms of knowledge. They're the assumptions or the stereotypes or the epitomes that we use to understand the world around us. Although we regularly think under the confines of social constructs, and here think the sun moving across the sky is a god riding his chariot across the sky, or diseases are caused by witchcraft, social constructs can become very real by the damage that they do. Consider the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. Right? When Mr. Arbery was running through a suburban neighborhood in Glynn County, Georgia, his murderers looked at him and thought, this man is running and black. He must have stolen something. As unchecked assumptions, social constructs portray others in a negative light can be very dangerous. Mr. Arbery's murderers were trained to see him, a black man, as a thief, as an intruder, and as somebody to fear. When we acknowledge race as a social construct, we realize that how these constructs are used is relevant in every discussion about discrimination. Take, for instance, a sign that reads, whites only. This overt, expressive statement is intended to exclude and illustrates the ways that race can be a basis for the exercise of the power to exclude others. But more importantly, perhaps, is the way that the act of using such words is the very claim to power. Posting whites only signifies that the speaker feels she has the authority to decide others' identity for them. As an expression of power, the act of classification communicates the power to decide who is valuable, who is entitled, and who is not. And in this, one of the most illustrative acts of aggression that can be exercised by a group is the original act of racial violence. Merely creating the classification is an act of racial violence. Privilege is feeling entitled to tell other people their identity. It is a power that has been exercised by white America for generations, whether in the enslavement of others as an act of colonialism, or by deciding who can love whom in the antebellum South, or deciding who can sit where, who can learn, or who can teach, or who can vote. And it continues today. Recently, I was informed by a white colleague that my world was limited because of my racial classification. And this was something that my colleague was very eager to provide for me. I was told that I am a white man. I am sure that my world is quite limited, and I'm okay with that. But it was this act, right? The act of declaring my racial and gender identity for me, in which I was denied my self-determination. I was denied the authority to choose my own identity. I was denied my history being raised as a Japanese American in a Japanese American family with Japanese American culture and beliefs and practices. I was denied my own history and my family and my culture. This was an act of stripping me of myself. Privilege is knowing that wherever you go, you don't have to justify your presence. It is knowing that you don't have to justify the color of your skin or your head covering or your practices and your prayer. Privilege is not constantly wondering who in the room despises you or who fears you or with whom your safety is at risk. And privilege is never having to wonder whether there are allies in the room. Privilege is neither understanding nor thinking to ask what violence and trauma has been done to another. Even deciding what constitutes violence and trauma illustrates the power of privilege. Or as Bell Hooks notes, there is no psychological practice that specifically focuses on recovery from racist victimization. This, in my view, should be the first objective as we work towards becoming more inclusive. We can engage in recovery from racist victimization. Now, as I noted before, this type of project may not follow a line from past progress in civil rights. And here the idea is not to challenge the progress of civil rights, but to recognize that recovery may take us in a very different direction. The objective requires a great deal of critical self-awareness and of examining privilege so that our communities are not supporting and further embedding these dangerous racial constructs. So, how do we get there? Well, first, we can be informed, right? Commit to learning about the culture of American oppression. Recognize that the histories that we are taught are not everybody's history, and that the moments and people we celebrate in American history are overwhelmingly white moments. Conduct a thorough self-assessment to determine whether the history you know is merely a history of white America. Recognize that a real American history includes the suffering and successes of people of color, the contributions that have been made to our collective benefits, and the ways that power has been used to erase those contributions. Second, be engaged. Engage your people of color neighbors. Have conversations and take note of how you participate. Are you talking or listening? Don't be offended if people of color are not ready to engage with you about race. And recognize that when you raise questions of race, it can be seen as aggressive and isolating and performative and even manipulative. Challenge your friends and family who express racist ideas or who are unwilling to talk about systemic racism. Engage in dialogue about privilege, not just those who are like-minded, but also, and especially those who do not engage in this kind of self-reflection. Third, be intentional. Do us all a favor and don't appropriate anti-racism campaigns and movements of your own. As your own, if you're not committed to changing the circumstances. Ask yourself whether you are passing along what you've learned without reflecting on it. Always refuse to see yourself as more enlightened. Help to create a circumstance where anti-racism is the norm and not just a word. Allyship means committing to a long, intentional, and engaged process of seeing and hearing those you purport to support. When we commit to allyship, that commitment should be to make a change that is better for those who are historically disadvantaged. It is not passive, and it is more than mere observation. Fourth, constantly examine your biases. Many, if not most folks, find comfort in feeling that they are not racist, and the sentiment is appreciated, particularly when it is the result of deep reflection and self-assessment. The problem is that racism is systemic. It is structural, and it is planted deep in very normal discourse and in laws and institutions. Everything that we have learned and observed, and all of our accomplishments, have been done in a context and in a legacy of racism and white supremacy, a context that we have engaged in merely by interacting in society. Fifth, make anti-racism a lifetime goal, a personality trait, and a life's mission. Attending a march is great, right? Holding a sign, also great. Forwarding Instagram posts and tweets is about the same. They're all great. But anti-racism is more than protesting the murder of Black children, women, and men. Anti-racism is about changing social constructs, normalizing equity, championing diversity, and facilitating inclusion. It is about improving the lives of the historically disadvantaged, maybe because you get a benefit, but definitely because the mistreatment of those designated as others is unjust and you can participate against it. So now we've shared some thoughts about race, and we can take some of these ideas and talk about space. Environmental protection did not originate in human rights, social and economic equity, diversity, or inclusivity. Audubon and Sierra Club were not very interested in hearing from racialized communities. Environmental legislation and the spaces that were protected were geared towards white people and middle and upper class values and spaces. Environmental organizations were and continue to be dominated by white faces. And in the meantime, 3 out of every Black and Latinx communities and 1/2 of Asian and Pacific Islander and indigenous communities lived and continue to live in areas with uncontrolled toxic waste sites. The environmental movement, which sought a healthy environment for us all, was very selective in who was included in us all. Likewise, open spaces were never made for people of color. People of color never had public spaces of their own. American history involves a history of removing indigenous people from national parks and other public lands, as well as their own homes. The overwhelming majority of public art and monuments and public spaces celebrates white history. Public spaces have been dominated by white people, white values, and white history. In contemporary life, the absence of white-only signs in public spaces has not erased the inequitable treatment of people of color. There may have been a shift, but likely not a meaningful one. And this is where we can talk about Christian Cooper, a Black man who unsuspectingly found himself guilty of bird watching while Black. It may be that Mr. Cooper's injury is more striking in the Northeast, a place that has largely forgotten its racial history, past practices of aggression, exclusion, and hate towards people of color. It may be that incidents of racial violence, both physically and conceptually, remain commonplace and normalized in private and public spaces. They also illustrate that public spaces retain the whites only sign, even if only conceptually. In this incident, Mr. Cooper was enjoying a day in Central Park on a Monday morning. He carried his binoculars and curiosities about some 230 odd bird species that occupied the Ramble area of Central Park. He noticed an unleashed dog in an area that was clearly marked to notify visitors to leash their dogs. And note, this was a requirement, not a recommendation, not a suggestion. When Mr. Cooper asked the dog owner, whose name coincidentally was Amy Cooper, to leash her dog, he was met with an exercise of power. Ms. Cooper, who later proclaimed that she is not a racist, was not ashamed of breaking the rules. Instead, she made clear that no Black man could speak to her that way, to call her out for breaking the rules, or even share space with her. And we might emphasize, especially a Black man. Many have seen the video at this point in which she said, "I am taking a picture and calling the cops. I'm going to tell them that there's an African-American man threatening my life." The tone in her voice strongly suggested that she was not feeling threatened. She was perfectly aware that she was capitalizing on a history of police brutality against Black men. She clearly assumed that Mr. Cooper would be seized with fear. In this act, a threat to call the police, the fabrication of a story in which Mr. Cooper was the aggressor, we see the way that these words can be weaponized against people of color. Brenton Watch, a staff writer for City Lab, describes the problem in this way. White people can weaponize the police against people who aren't white, and that power only flows in one direction. The way Amy Cooper reacted in the video shows that she was aware of this power dynamic. All it took was for a white person to send a bat signal, or in Amy Cooper's case, a racial dog whistle, to make a garden unsafe for a Black person. So long as people of color, and Black men in particular, are seen as a potential danger, the issue of racial equity in parks and other open and public spaces goes unresolved. With this in mind, a very normal sentiment in dialogues about inclusivity is confusion about the lack of people of color in public spaces, and in forests in particular. The common comment is, "We have created the space. Why don't people of color come?" The confusion is typically bolstered by broad statements that everyone enjoys nature. Everyone benefits by being in nature. If you build it, they will come, and everyone is welcome. This question, presented as a conundrum, an elusive hitch in the effort to be open to all, is understandable, but I think it misses the problem of cause and effect, of cultural bias in particular spaces, and of racial history and racial presence, and it did not help Mr. Cooper. Space is often characterized by occupation, decoration, celebration, use, and exclusion. But because space comes with a history, space is always racialized. But we often think of shared spaces as safe spaces. We promote and characterize shared spaces as open to all, for the benefit of all, for the enjoyment of all. We use words like we and us and our to discuss shared space. But we do it without acknowledging that the act of using words like we and us can deliver the same type of racial violence. When I went to college, I was excited. I had visions of pursuing knowledge and understanding, gaining insights into the inner workings of natural and built things. I planned to touch wisdom from a broad spectrum of disciplines and ideas, and I really wanted to go to college parties. Before leaving for college, I received a letter that gave me instructions for my arrival. I was told I would have a roommate and that I would live in a dormitory. I was invited to share space with other college students who I imagined were pursuing their own similar ideas and goals. The invitation was to share space. And in that space, this invitation was to find a place of my own. When I arrived on campus, the RA, the resident assistant, met me at the door. He did not shake my hand. He did not welcome me. No welcome package with pages of helpful information, no hats bearing the school's logo to build school spirit. Instead, he held up his hand and told me not to enter. Now, I don't think it was his intention to exclude me for being me, but it was a very confusing experience. There's a problem, he said, and we will have to work this out. Now, as a relatively rational person with a marginally at least inquisitive mind, I wanted to know about the problem. He tried to avoid my question. We need to find you a different room, he said, and I eventually coerced the answer from him. Your roommate said, I'm not going to live with a fucking Jap. My RA did apologize to me, but he threw up his hands as if to say, what can you do? I was led to the parking lot and told to remain there. And I sat there in that hot sun for 4 hours in this semi-public space, a shared space, sitting on my bags of clothes and bed sheets and pillows and a radio. And I waited for the administration to do me the favor of finding me a place to live, of finding me a different space. What made this absurd is not that I wasn't offered the opportunity to choose my own roommates, or that the aggressor did not lose any power from his racism, or the length of time it took to get me situated, or the institutional inaction against this would-be roommate, or the soft and nonchalant way I was told that I was not wanted. What made this absurd was the idea that the parking lot would be a safe space, a space that I would want to occupy during this experience. What made it absurd is the notion that I would be protected in this space, a mere 10 feet away from the dormitory doorway, 10 feet where it was told to me that I was not wanted. The parking lot was a space that I shared with all those that had leveled this violence against me. The supposedly safe space was surrounded by a hostile world, and it was part of it. Space, from my experience, is always racialized. Now, privilege is not wondering whether particular spaces are open to you. Privilege comes with the belief that everyone wants what you have, that others want to occupy your spaces. And privilege is not knowing to ask whether that's true. To be inclusive, we have to do more than open our doors and our forests. We need to think beyond what a natural space looks and feels like for all people. We need to think about and act on what safe spaces look like to the others. This means being aware of how many Trump signs or Confederate flags you pass on the way to the forest. We may disagree with those signs and symbols, or those signs and symbols may give us a sense of belonging. But to a person of color, those signs communicate something very different, something hostile, something unwanted, and something unsafe. Those signs ultimately prevent a sense of place and a sense of belonging. We should always be thinking about how such signs look to someone on the outside. We should think about someone who might say that the forest, that the space does not look like me, does not sound like me, did not grow up like me, doesn't include me or excludes me, doesn't interest me, is not what I need, that I cannot get there, I cannot go there, or that I would not go there. In large part, we haven't accomplished this feat. And in this exercise, we need to be open to imagine how our words and institutions and spaces appear to others. Just building the space does not appear as an invitation to everyone. The goal must be to shift away from the open arms approach as a grounding strategy to an approach that favors self-awareness, acknowledgement, and listening. All right, having discussed race and space, now we can turn to place. Spaces can become places. They do not always become places, but they can. However, when we think about spaces that do become places, we see that the difference between the two is the attachment that we feel to the space. This attachment that's known as sense of place is what Bell Hooks calls belonging. Belonging, an anti-racist term that can shed light on policies leading to recovery from racial discrimination, should be the goal of inclusivity in matters involving land. As Ed Ralph says in Place and Placelessness, place, both as a concept and a phenomenon of experience, has a remarkable capacity to make connections between self, community, and earth, between what is local and particular and what is regional and worldwide. It is the intimate and specific basis for how each of us connects to the world and how the world connects with us. We can acknowledge and experience this intimacy. We can read the generous values that communities write about in their vision statements and plans. These statements are expressions of self-worth and perseverance. They detail community vision, and they offer them as strength, the kind of strength that makes such a place a grand place to live. And simply the process of imagining people and events in a space can alter and enrich one's connection to a place, one's experience of that place, and perhaps even a more authentic way of being in that place. Yet everywhere we see spaces that are not complete as places, authenticity is required for a unique and honest sense of place. Authenticity requires taking ownership of one's history. We look to our histories to find our sense of self. We look back to find our identity. Yet some folks try very hard to avoid history. Such people tend to think of history as a burden, something to be ignored or hidden, and in many cases escaped. Building a sense of place or a sense of belonging means acknowledging a history that can be an obstacle to belonging. It means paying close attention to the words that we use to determine whether we are being inclusive. To this point, Yi-Fu Tuan has detailed the manner in which ethnocentrism drives communities to distinguish between we and they. And he notes, we are always at the center. Human beings lose human attributes in proportion as they are removed from the center. In this process, we risk propping ourselves up as human while finding that the others who are not we are not fully human. As Tuan says, the more one it appears as they, the less human they are. Now, communities can engage in this kind of reading, the kind that decodes the coded language, that decenters whiteness, and the kind that engages a sense of belonging to the land. We can engage in the kind of reasoning that identifies others as fully human. For instance, consider this very common community vision. Children need natural areas where they can play and explore freely, feeling as comfortable in the woods as anywhere. Now, this policy appeals to me personally. I love the idea of finding a place where children can feel very comfortable and free, a place that is safe for them to explore. The problem is that not everyone explores forests freely in this way. Many people of color do not feel comfortable in the woods, which have historically been dominated by white rural communities. People of color have been shot while jogging, threatened while birdwatching. Those escaping slavery ran through and hid in the woods from violent pursuers. There's a history here that must be acknowledged, and especially because that history tells us so much about the present. We can strive to make sure that people of color can make these intimate connections with the land and can do so in a way that reverses discrimination. This type of reading could support more inclusive policies that can be and should be adopted by anti-racist communities. For instance, communities could make forests and trails safer and more inclusive by asking partners of color to design and manage parking and trails. Communities could implement programs in schools that foster outdoor education and a recreation pipeline for students of color. They can play an active and intentional role in creating future environmental professionals by introducing diverse students to the profession and supporting a pipeline for diverse students to pursue professional roles in natural resources conservation. Communities can participate in reparations by committing lands to leases and ownership, farming, recreational, and conservation practices for people of color. Communities can affirm that reparations objectives are consistent with the community vision. Communities can reserve spaces for people of color and recognize that for several centuries in the United States.
Okay, perfect.
Hey, Mike, we can hear you, buddy. Recognize that for several centuries in the United States, public places have largely been white spaces. People of color need their own space, and so communities can commit lands to be held in trust and managed by partners of color. And finally, communities can re-indigenize forests and public lands. So tonight we've been talking about a choice that needs to be made. As communities and folks interested in conservation, are we acting in an anti-racist and inclusive way? Addressing this question means engaging in an iterative process, one in which we constantly re-examine our privilege, especially the way that privilege is relevant to our own sense of place. It means we ask whether our actions illustrate a commitment to anti-racism, whether our approach to inclusivity means expecting people to come to us, or whether we go to meet people in their own spaces. I've heard quite a bit in diversity and inclusion discussions about how proud folks are for engaging in a self-assessment of privilege. And in these conversations, I often hear people wondering when this self-assessment ends. I understand the questions and I understand the pride, but I think these discussions are going in the wrong direction. Being anti-racist means the progress will not be linear. It involves so much culture and history, so many embedded practices, so many assumptions dictated by dangerous social constructs. And as such, the very idea of completing the self-assessment simply is not realistic. Inclusivity and anti-racism are not achievable without recognizing the complexity of excavating racism from oneself and one's history. Conservation presents an opportunity to disrupt historical practices of segregation and exclusion. We are in a position to be unapologetically anti-racist, to act in a way that reverses displacement, to foster a sense of belonging in spaces that are historically white dominated. To sincerely engage in inclusive practices, we need to be constantly aware that our communities, properties, and words occur in a historical context. We are all racists, and ignoring that fact does not solve any problems. It is an active erasure of history, an erasure of identity, and as such, it is a violent act. In closing, I'd like to share part of a letter published by the self-fashioned concerned Black woman from her open letter to the Union of Concerned Scientists on Black Death, Black Silencing, and Black Fugivity. The author asks us to affirm Black life, and she writes, "You can listen, ask questions with curiosity and care. Be open to the responses by listening compassionately, even if it's not what you want to hear, even if it's inconvenient or goes against everything you believe. You too have truths to tell, share them patiently, and affirm Black life. Say hello to your Black neighbors instead of making uncomfortable faces and crossing the street when they walk by. Instead of buying doorbell cameras and high security systems to protect property because you think your neighborhood is unsafe, inquire about why the material conditions of people around you have not been met, and ask what you can do to invest in their safety and their well-being. And please stop calling the cops. If you make conditions better for the Black people around you, you will inevitably make them better for everyone else. And not just the friendly Black people present in your social circles, but the ones on the streets, the queer, trans, immigrant, disabled, incarcerated, poor, and uneducated Black folks too. None of us are free until we all are. This, I think, is the work that we must do. And I thank you for attending this lecture tonight.
Thank you, Keith. That was really great and thought-provoking. If there are questions, this is a great time for people to put them in the chat. Depending on the number of people asking questions, we could probably have people unmute too and speak directly. Doesn't look like we have any questions so far. Yeah, Tanya notes that the quote, "None of us are free until we all are," is very powerful and gives us all a lot to think about.
Hey, Tanya.
There was a hand up. I saw somebody had a hand up.
Oh, I think that was Kat. Kat, did you have a comment or question, or were you clapping?
Oh, that was the clapping emoji.
Ah, got it.
It's difficult to tell the difference.
Yeah. I have a question. I'll turn my video on. It's
Hey, Annie, how you doing?
Hey, Keith. Good. That was really, really wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think sometimes we think about how can we make our lands welcoming and safe for everyone. And you're talking about having lands that are, you know, planned by and for people of color as a safe space. And I wonder if there's how those things eventually overlap and intersect so that we can actually coexist in nature. Yeah.
So just to be clear, so what was it that you wanted me to comment on?
Well,
How to
just
create
that,
safe
like,
spaces?
yeah, how like does it always have to be separate? I mean, this separateness makes it safe, and that's, you know, that's obvious, but I just wonder how, like, whether the communities can be integrated.
Yeah. And I don't think anybody thinks they can't be, but I think the problem is that there's a lot of work to do, right? And that overcoming a racial history means trying to, you know, what Bell Hooks is talking about is this idea of thinking about, you know, how do you approach this sort of trauma of victimization when we don't have that as a category of injury even, right? The fact that there have never been, right, Black spaces or exclusively Black spaces, and that's not the case for white spaces. So I think that the idea of shared spaces is a great one, right? And I think that when folks talk about this, or some of the literature on this talks about, is that, you know, maybe we need to go further than thinking shared spaces as the next step, right? Because maybe that may not work. And that's the example that we see with bird watching while black. I don't think that there's one strategy that fixes it, and I don't think that there's any strategy that fixes it faster. But I think that an array of approaches that has to include exclusive spaces for people of color allows us to envision what it would look like to have a truly shared space.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that answered everything.
Yeah, no, it's complicated.
It's complicated.
It's complicated.
My favorite phrase, yes.
Yeah.
We do have a question in the chat. Karen says the idea of re-indigenizing community spaces is interesting. Can you say more about this?
Well, some work has been done to think about some of the challenges of reparations and re-indigenizing forests and many spaces, including national parks. Some of the complications include how do you envision that in a system that is already overladen with private property rights and very historic ways of drawing boundaries that allow people to have exclusive control. The idea of re-indigenizing the forests or one way of thinking about this is to use private property, the system that already exists in the way that we've divided up most of the country already, to use those to re-indigenize areas by effectively granting private property rights. And there's been an awful lot of pushback against that. The idea of re-indigenizing any area by using what is essentially a colonial type of power structure is maybe not one that indigenous folks want buy-in for or want to benefit from. And so some of the folks that talk about this have talked about sort of identifying areas where we don't allow the private property system to be the way that we divide up rights and access and use and value. There's some work to be done on it. The reason that people point more particularly to, say, national parks is, at least in theory, those are areas that are already held in trust, free of private property boundaries. And so thinking about those kinds of public spaces as having easier access to re-indigenization might be something we're thinking about. So I think it's a long conversation. And it's a long conversation because it involves trying to figure out, in particular, how to deal with private property rights, right? The ways that we've divided up these lands already, whether those are taken back or whether we figure out other ways to release those lands from exclusive practices. Anyway, it's a long conversation. I'm happy to engage in it. It's just going to take some time.
Keith.
Yes. Hi, Jeff. How you doing?
I'm doing all right. The concept of a separate area which is considered safe harkens back to separate but equal. And I've never thought that actually worked.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, sure. Let's talk about that, right? Separate but equal. What was never an equal? It was always a separate, and that's the way that policy went. The idea of exclusive spaces for people of color is first and foremost an idea of reallocating power. Right? This is not an issue of let's take public spaces where we're going to disempower some folks. This is an empowerment idea. So I hear what you're saying, but it's a constitutional matter. They're very different ideas. At least because, and I can imagine if what you're meaning by that is if whoever gets to choose where exclusive spaces are going to occur, the worst lands inaccessible, no natural resources to speak of, no wealth, then I can imagine that would be a similar situation. But this is an idea of sort of capitalizing on the right to exclude, to give more power to folks that have been disempowered for centuries. So it does, I think it turns out a little bit differently, but I understand what you're saying.
Well, I was thinking more in terms of empowering people to use joint spaces.
Yeah. I mean, I understand. Yeah, and I think that's the ultimate goal, is breaking boundaries and breaking exclusivity entirely. The dilemma is whether shared spaces can be truly shared until we have reversed the history of racism and discrimination. And I think a lot of
But
the experience. I'm sorry.
That suggests that we have to wait.
Well, maybe it does suggest there's some time involved, but I think it also, what it suggests to me is that simply opening up the door is not going to create a shared space.
Right.
And that's what's difficult, right? Is that when we talk about reversing racism and reversing a history of discrimination, it means a reallocation, right? It means not just opening the door, but opening the door and giving somebody other than us the keys.
An agency.
Right. Yeah. Giving the power to choose where, to decide how, to choose how to set it up.
But you can't do anything to that. You can't do anything like that until you open the door.
So I'm not sure I agree with that, Jeff. Right. So let's say, for instance, a land trust. Right. Land trusts are historically well funded, lots of space. Right. They're good opportunities for investment, and they're groups that have always taken advantage of what we call free market environmentalism. They're using property rights that come with all of the power of property. There's no reason that land trusts can't use their lands and hand over the keys to a group that has been historically disempowered. There's no reason that we can't reserve some percentage of acquired lands by RPA, either to hold in trust or to hand over to a group that historically has not had the power to participate in the market of real property. That's different than opening the doors, right? And maybe dramatically so, right? It's like I said, it's not a linear progression, right? The linear progression is to say, let's keep working on the openness of our shared spaces to make sure that people keep coming in and say eventually get more comfortable. But I'm not sure that's working, right? Because we've done that for a pretty long time. And so, if we're going to think about nonlinear or a different direction of making progress, that is to say, if we're going to talk about not acclimation and integration, but a a different kind of reversal of discrimination, the first thing we need to do is empower folks that have no power. And one way to do that would be to embolden them with property rights or the kinds of rights that they haven't enjoyed all along, right? It's different than the way we think about it now, but it's also more of a reversal of history, and maybe that's what's needed.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, hi Rachel, good to see you.
Hey, I was just thinking about connected spaces. I don't know. It's just I am sometimes struck by, in many of the urban communities, say North Troy or whatever, how strong the connection to place, to community and place right there is, more than someone's connection to suburbia. This is, and the strength of that. And so then I was just thinking about this, claiming green spaces, within those areas, and then connectedness out from those areas, and I don't know, the potential safety of that progression of working from something that's connected to where you already are. I don't know. And my mind was just wandering down that when you said hi. So
Sorry about that.
yeah, I don't, so it's have a thought in development, but
yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, I think if you start that conversation not thinking about public spaces but communities, right? So these are private spaces that are connected, in which we share common goals, right? This is where the idea of sense of place and belonging really kind of comes from. And in fact, the folks that talk about this, like my Ralph quote, also talks about how once we move into suburbia, we start kind of losing sense of place, right? And in fact, he starts, that's where he finds placelessness, that sort of the suburban lack of character, lack of history to the ground, lack of sense of community. People have really big fences and don't have barbecues anymore or something like that. But in urban communities, right, we have a lot of shared cultural values and beliefs and practices that lead to that sense of place. Public spaces in those areas mean something different. I'm not sure they have ever been anything other than dominated by whiteness. And I think that the argument would be, even with places that have only urban access, where other people who aren't from urban areas don't go, that's where we have the police, right? So there's a different kind of control of those spaces, a different kind of use and access to those spaces than we have anywhere else, right? And certainly not in the forest. So they may not be the best sort of analogy to build from on that, at least not the public spaces part. I think the sense of belonging that comes out of that is something that is buildable, right? In ways that we might find different kinds of access outside of communities as well. I think it's super interesting.
Mm-hmm, 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 mm-hmm. And I think not to not for like me to imagine what would work, but to find out what would work to somehow to support what would work, and be open to whatever those ideas might be, because they might be different from something that I might think of.
Right. I mean, I think that's super important, right? This notion that, and that Rachel, you and I have talked about before, right? This thing about whether, space outside of one's world, right? What does it take to get somebody to look at that and identify with is very complicated, right? And that, the idea of inviting somebody to your space without understanding what they need and what they want is not likely to be successful ever, right? Which is why groups like land trusts need to get out of our own spaces to figure out how our spaces might serve other people's needs. And until that happens, there's not really a good conversation about what land trusts can do for other people who aren't already in those spaces.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I think it's complicated.
Yeah. Kathleen has an excellent question in the chat.
Yeah, let me read this question, a great question Kat put in the chat. To what extent does committing to this goal of inclusivity as a land trust organization involve allowing historically alienated communities to reshape the goals and priorities of the organization itself? What might this look like, and what might be the first steps to facilitate this change?
Fantastic question. And for those of you who don't know, Kat has been working with RPA very intensely on some rural-urban interface projects that we refer to as benefit flows, and trying to figure out how benefit flows analysis can cross boundaries, right? Not just boundaries of jurisdictions, but boundaries of types of communities of values and some such thing. But so this is a fantastic question, right? So how does an organization transform and how it sees inclusivity? And is that something that comes from the outside or the inside and some such things? And, again, there are there are a lot of different ways to think about approaching this. One of them is changing the face of the organization itself, right? We talk about hiring practices and board member recruitment practices and changing, simply the appearance of how that group operates. To think about, go through the process of examining privilege and power and race to see whether our organizational documents should be reformed for that. But another one that is also, I don't know if this is low-hanging fruit, but partnerships are awfully important, right? Because they allow for this exchange of ideas, for this assessment. And in environmental matters, we always talk about thinking about different ways to achieve the result, which might be, envisioning a different result than what we had started with. And we do that by comparing very different ways of achieving that result. There are very different ways of achieving the results, the community-based results that land trusts want to accomplish, that are being done by very different groups, right? And having those partnerships, having those conversations, and through dialogue, thinking about how the exchange of ideas can make us rethink how to get there is just a really good idea. Expanding the network of interested parties and stakeholders beyond just what conservation land trusts do. Thinking about urban land trusts, thinking about vacant lands groups, thinking about how reparations groups are working, what policies work for them. Thinking about student groups, right? Bringing young folks like RPA does right into the organization, right, of the group is ways to get out of the boxes that we create for ourselves. So yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. I think there's no first step. I think there are 100 first steps that go in different directions. And with them all, I think we find out where we might go next.
Keith, I was thinking about, your idea of nonlinear progress, which, like in some sense is sort of a foreign idea to me, or a foreign idea in our culture. And, it made me think that it feels like to me that part of the reason that's the case is that we are taught history and we view history, we have a view of history as this linear thing, but that probably that in itself is sort of an expression of power, right? Because whoever has the power is writing the history. And, they have the power to sort of impose this linearity on it that's not there in real life. And I mean, I'm not sure exactly where I'm going with this question, but it just makes me think that, there's got to be a relationship with that. We've almost been like brainwashed into this idea that things are supposed to move in a linear fashion. History marches in a linear way, and progress, progress is history in the making, right? So that should be linear as well.
Right. So
There's
yeah,
a big messy question.
A big messy. So I mean, yeah, that's really interesting too, right? Especially if we think about the way we read history and the trajectory of history as being something that's very natural, right? We always think we're taught that things are very natural. So we learn that history developed this way, and maybe because there was a war, maybe because there was somebody really charismatic making decisions or whatever, and we see how history progressed. And certainly there's an awful lot of erasure that happens there, right? And it also makes us very surprised to find that the trajectory we were on did not actually capture all the values that we thought we were accomplishing. Environmental justice is a great example of this, right? Because our environmental protection agenda went towards pollution prevention, right? 1969 happened, rivers were catching on fire, tankers were dumping in San Francisco, and people were getting cancer from Love Canal. And all of a sudden people said, we need to control pollution, right? And so we went down this, much more scientific road to control pollution. And one of the ways of telling the story is realizing that as the more and more we deferred to scientists, the less and less we thought about people, right? About communities, about the cultural values, social values, some such things. And so when in 1987, we see this fantastic report that says, doggone it, we've been doing a great job of controlling pollution for white people, but not for any people of color. We had to stop for a minute and think about the ways we were making this progress in environmental protection. And arguably, I mean, depending on how you view that story, environmental law took a sharp left turn there, right? And it went from pollution prevention to pollution prevention and adding equality and equity, right? And so thinking about doing environmental law in a much different way, or at least added, arguably, maybe another line to it or something. But the idea is, right, that the way we make progress, at least for every decision we make, it creates a whole new context to think about what's fact and what's fiction, what law should do, right? What our values are, what directions they should go. And so with that new context, you might think about that as a different direction anyway. But even if you don't, our next decision probably doesn't follow the same values as the last one, right? And that's what environmental justice really is thinking about, it's not just science, it's science and, civil rights, and it's science and cultural values, right? And science and all these other things. And so what you see is much more of a zigzag, or maybe even more, sort of circular kind of analysis that brings us back to the beginning of what we were doing with environmental protection, and the second time around trying to do it better. But whatever the case may be, again, I agree with you that the idea of something being linear in its progress probably doesn't represent what we were really doing, even if we're being told that that's what we were doing.
Thanks. We're at about 10 after the hour here. I see there's really one more question in the chat that looks really great. So I'm going to ask that question, and then I think we should probably move towards wrapping up. The question, Keith, is what would enforcement of spaces specifically for people of color in nature look like? How do those spaces stay safe for people of color and keep white people from encroaching and disrespecting those spaces?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. And one of the reasons it's a fantastic question, and this I think goes back to the conversation we were having with Jeff a minute ago, is one of the reasons this is a fantastic question is we would never ask this question about white spaces, right? This is not a question that requires any thought, right? Either we call the cops or we protect it with property. One of the ways of thinking about this is empowerment for people of color communities through the same ways, right, that sort of white Americans had power throughout the ages. Is we could use the traditional methods of enforcement of exclusive spaces or rights to claim identity and value, right, and of the many ways that we do that. But I think it's a fantastic question because it's a real question, even though it shouldn't be, right? But what I would say is, once we figure out what the right mechanism might be, and maybe it is as simple as empowering through property, right? That should come with all of the suite of enforcement mechanisms that have benefited property owners for centuries. And if we choose a different mechanism, we can think about that too. But I think it's important to recognize that the same enforcement mechanism should be available to all. And asking the question, just fantastic question, is sort of buy-in to the making it look like there's a problem in accomplishing spaces for people of color. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Scott. Thank you, Keith. This has been a really excellent talk. Thanks for your talk and for taking time to, wade through all those questions. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. I hope you'll be able to join us next month. We have another guest speaker lecture. And I'd just like to thank all of you for taking this time to join us and participate in this important conversation. And we hope to see you again soon.
And thank you all for attending.
Annie Jacobs wants to say something.
Oh, hi.
Yeah,
Annie.
yeah. I want to say that the next talk is with Chaya Harris and Benita Laudio of Outdoor Afro. And Outdoor Afro is a national organization with chapters throughout the country. but Benita Chaya is the national, I'm not sure her position, but she works nationally. Benita is local and she's working on starting an outdoor Afro chapter here. And so this conversation of what can RPA provide to this group, which we've started that conversation with them, but we have a lot to talk about with them to, figure out what does it look like? How can we do the kinds of things that Keith was just talking about? So it should be a really good talk.
Yeah, thank
And
you,
if-
Annie.
I know we're-
Hopefully registration for that talk will be up tomorrow.
And that's on October 23rd, right? October 28th, sorry.
And Kara, did you have a question as well?
I just wanted to mention, first of all, fantastic talk. I'm just
Thank
thrilled
you.
that I'm just thrilled that this is a talk at RPA. Just thrilled. And just in closing, to mention just that if people wanted to plug into more of this work through RPA, that my understanding is that there's the DEI committee that people could potentially take part further in continuing the conversation through that committee. I just thought that leaving off with that would be a great thing to say. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for mentioning that. And if anyone is interested in having a discussion about that, you could contact anyone on the RPA staff and we'd be glad to talk to you about it. So thanks again, Keith. Thanks everybody for joining us. Thank you for taking the time and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Good night.